an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Well, here we are. It is the first day of March as we record this episode of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in. Brought to you by the folks at Story Studio Network. John Wright is here. He is an executive VP at Maru Public Opinion. And Keith Leslie in the house. Puts in appearances on CH Television. And a regular contributor from time to time on The O Show with Laura Babcock. Just on that, Keith, boy, every time I open my social media, Laura's lighting a fire in Hamilton. I mean, oh my.
It doesn't stop. That woman is one hell of an advocate for the city of Hamilton, the people, particularly the homeless people. She's been doing a food line every Saturday for a long while now. Yeah, she picks the issues and she calls them out on it. And their vote last week, that was an 8-8 council split, to not use a parking lot in Stony Creek to put some temporary housing for people without homes. That lit her on fire, and a lot of the city. Made some national news, didn't it? You're literally going to keep these parking spaces open as opposed to putting some temporary shelter in there. And these are parking lots. What? Anyway, yes, she's a very strong advocate. People keep saying she should run for office. She says she does not want to do that. But I think at some point she has so much in the game, she may end up, I think, being a candidate locally.
Yeah, well, and then that would change the conversation in a hurry, right? I mean, I that's not meant as a slam, but I know a lot of people kind of get to that point of advocacy and passionately committed to the community, and then as soon as you step into the political ring, and we've seen this happen a lot, all of a sudden you become a different human being. So I don't know whether or not Laura would be, interested in making that pivot, but you're right.
She's not. She says,
yeah,
and I believe her.
Yeah, no, I do too.
There comes a point you get pushed so far, especially if you find that one issue that just you have to be, you're just going to take it further than you've been able to take it as an advocate.
Yeah. There's lots we want to get to today, but I think we certainly have to talk about the news that was made last night. And when I saw that Brian Mulroney had passed away at the age of 84, and I told my wife, she's sitting on the couch, we're watching TV, and I saw it in my social media feed, and she said, so today's the day that Trudeau took a walk in the snow, and today's the day that Mulroney passed away. So the 29th of February is unique for so many reasons. Historically, John, politically, that's kind of going to be the thing that we'll remember that leap day for, in so many respects.
It's interesting that it's all a matter of weather when it comes to this sort of stuff. And, I really, when I was a parliamentary intern in 1980-81, I then left to go and work at a company headed up by Norman Atkins, who went on to run Mulroney's back-to-back campaign. So I spent 6.5 years with that group and Hugh Siegel, and it was an interesting time for a very young man from Markham to be part of that world, because Mr. Mulroney was bigger than life. I mean, you could say a lot of things about him, but he walked in the valley with giants. And it's a far cry different than it is today. I mean, you take a look at the things that he accomplished, whether it be opening up nations around the world to crusade against apartheid in South Africa. I remember that very much. And I'm sure you remember when Nelson Mandela visited the Canadian Parliament right after he'd been released. I think it was like 4 months or something like that. And you can go through the litany of incredible things that were done, whether it be on free trade, the first acid rain negotiation between the two countries. You could even mark the GST, which came in and was hated at the time, but certainly help manufacturers. I mean, you too will remember and go through even more in that list. But I had a real opportunity to meet him at a function. I remember, I went to a lot of functions. All of us did. You went to speeches and all that sort of stuff. But one of them was in Washington, It was at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it was on I think it was the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, and they had President Salinas, the former president of Mexico, and they had George Bush Sr. there, and they had Mr. Mulroney. And it was a private luncheon with about 400 people in Washington at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it probably was the most memorable moment that I'd had, and still do remember it so clearly. I got invited back to meet with the wives and the prime minister and the two presidents just beforehand. There were just like 5 of us in the room, and then went out and sat in the audience. And the first speeches that were given, first by Mr. Salinas and then by Mr. Bush, were fairly, straightforward about the accomplishments of the two countries. But Brian Mulroney got up, and I think it crystallized the moment when most people in the room felt that he was worthy enough to give the eulogies for future presidents. He held the room in the palm of his hands. It was pure magic. And for a Canadian who'd gone to all of these other speeches and listened to these tales that he would tell in that voice, in when that self-deprecating humor, with that one hand in his pocket as he had that twinkle in his eye in the room. For most of the Americans there, they'd never experienced that. And it was pure magic and pure pride, where, 380 people out of the 400 kind of looked at him in awe as he extemporaneously dealt with it. And it took me back to just, you can take issues that after he left office, and got involved with some things, and we could talk about that. But if you took that off the table, it was all personal. It was all to get a phone call and to hear that voice and to hear that chuckle at the end of the phone. It was like marrying history with destiny. You could hear it in the voice. And he would say, I remember hearing all the tales from Norman and Hugh about him calling at 2:00 in the morning. I'm sure the NyQuil was kicking in at that point. But he would call people across the country constantly. And so I begin with that story because I then reflect on where we are today with this country and this prime minister. And I'm not going to be partisan about it. I'm just going to say we are so parochial. I mean, Justin Trudeau, from the first time he went to Davos, said, and John Manley, I think, said to him, Prime Minister, we've got these sort of things going on in the world that we have to talk about. And he looked over, and Jerry Butts, I think, touched the prime minister on the knee and said, those are all domestic issues that we have to talk about today, not international. I mean, it's got to play at home. So I reflect on the difference of the time in 1984 through to, when he finally left office. There was a big gulf of, the approval ratings and the seats. I think he was at 9% when he left office or something like that. And then I look today and I see the issues that we're dealing with and how we're seen on the stage. And it's, if you didn't live then, you don't know what it was like. And it really was a time when you see that photograph with, and we could say it off by heart, Helmut Kohl, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher. I think it was Ito of Japan, Gorbachev, like true giants of the day. And then you look where we are today, and it's basically people in a room in some part of the country talking about things that really don't matter in a world sense. So that was my reflection, was both personal, but also just to remember the time, having done all the polling during that time, having worked on so many things, having been part of so many rooms where he was in. It really was, and I don't think it's comparable since.
Well, Keith, you just rhyme off the names: Reagan, Thatcher, Gorbachev, Pope John Paul II, Lech Walesa. Compare that to the cast and crew that we now have internationally. That's just an interesting juxtaposition of character and political, quality. But John, and others have touched on the significance of the policy and the vision that was, whether you agreed with his politics or not, you got to say apartheid, GST, free trade, all these big things that happen. And we even suggested that last week provincially. When was the last time we had a majority government of the day that had a huge legacy piece that is going to actually be something we'll look back on and say that signified and characterized that particular political era in a province or the country. Mulroney had a wallet full of them.
He had a global vision, and he wanted to play on the global stage, and he was often criticized for his ego. And I have a couple little anecdotes that are not about his achievements, but it's just about me as a reporter covering him. And generally, because I was based out of Toronto most of the time, not Ottawa, I was doing, the fill-in ones, the speeches that he'd come to Toronto to give and that sort of thing. And I remember there was one speech in the mid-'80s. I think it was called the Bishop's Dinner, or the Cardinal's Dinner. Cardinal's Dinner.
Yeah.
5,000 people at the then new convention center. Big open room.
Would have been Cardinal Carter at the time.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, exactly. And Mulroney enters to the then new song by Tears for Fears called Everybody Wants to Rule the World. And I knew that no matter what he was going to say in the speech, I had my first radio hit.
Yeah.
And in fact, so I was doing it up at the side of the room. And I remember this reporter from the Globe and Mail, Ross McDonald, I think his name was. He came over and he said, What did you just say? What was that song? And he wrote it down. He says, who was the band? And I said, Tears for Fears. And he went, well, screw that. Just scratch it. That bit of color wasn't going to make it in the Globe. But it was a great bit of it. But just as Mulroney, because of, he was known to have the ego and the Gucci slippers and the nightclub, that entering to that song at that time was pretty bold, I thought.
Well, especially at a fundraiser that was there for all the Catholic charities in the city.
Exactly. John mentioned several times the voice. And that was always my issue with covering Mulroney, was he had a better radio voice than I did. So when I had to use his voice in the middle of my pieces, I didn't want to, because he had that great voice. Another time I was on, again, I hate to call it this, but it's what it was. I was on the Mulroney Death Watch. He was going to the Briar in Kitchener, the opening of the Briar, and I was assigned to go and follow him wherever he goes. Not knowing a lot about curling, I knew enough that he was going to throw the first stone. He did. Got that. And then I noticed he got up and he starts with his entourage and he starts leaving and going back under the bowels of the arena. And so I hopped up, got my tape deck and microphone and followed him around and went down this hall and turned around, and he went in the bathroom. And I realized I'd come right in behind him. And what are we going to do at this point? But put the tape deck on the counter and go leave a proper space and stand at the urinal one over. So these are my meetings with Mulroney. He just looked at me and laughed. He knew exactly what I had done. He knew exactly why I was there. And he just gave a chuckle. And he actually waited outside for me and gave me a little quick one-on-one for the Briar.
Right.
Just that kind of guy. He had a rough relationship with the media many times, deservedly so. His time after office was particularly contentious, I think. But he did one thing in office that really, really bothered me personally. And that was he took the Voodoo fighter jets that were stationed in my hometown of Chatham, New Brunswick, and moved them to Bagotville, Quebec, near Baie-Comeau. And that literally destroyed my hometown. The BMQs are now retirement homes for people at $500 a month. It's there's nobody there. But that was a political decision. And as I say, that's one I'm taking against him personally. I'm sure the people in Baie-Comeau and the Bagotville area loved him for it. I just have to say, there was an anecdote last night that I listened to, and it really summed him up, and it was incredible. It was this, I can't remember who the reporter is, but you would know this, both of you. He was being interviewed by a throng of reporters. There was cameras on him, and he was moving in a particular direction. And the throng was just with him, and it was moving, but it was moving at a snail's pace. And the reporter said, you suddenly realize that he was deliberately taking baby steps. Like every calculated move in the man was to make sure that the throng was still with him, that he wasn't moving through them, and so it was a master politician in so many ways. And the loyalty of his caucus, like even when the ship was below water on all decks. They were cheering him on. And again, it was this personal touch. And you hear of the legend of him calling people all the time. It's something that this prime minister and other prime ministers haven't done. Although I put Stephen Harper pretty close to being, level with him in many respects. And Jean Chrétien. But other than that, as you guys know, I live in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Well, Brian Mulroney
went to school there.
Hero in this town.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the Mulroney Center that he opened a few years ago at St. FX University here. When they had, I'm trying to think of the name of the conference, they called it last fall. Mulroney came and he sat for 4 days in that hall, meeting with the other people all there. I did notice he did have some matching green Gucci loafers that went with his jacket. But nonetheless, he looked great. But he stayed. He participated. It wasn't one of those come in, do the big thing, and get out. Even though he can do those and be very impressive in the speeches, he participated. He stuck around. As I say, he kind of walks on water in this town. It's very interesting to see. Brian Mulroney can do no wrong here. But it's nice to see a place that has that kind of respect for him and that is building literally facilities right around his name. I mean, it's quite impressive. What's
really cool, Keith, and I'm sure you've been there at St. Avex, is his office.
Mm-hmm.
I know people don't know that. It's I think when it was first done, people sort of said, well, it's like, the presidential library, for all of these people where, you would have former presidents where it would replicate the office and you would see it, things like that. I've never seen the inside of a prime minister's office so well displayed. And it was, right to the windows with the vision over, West Block and the Parliament. It really is something. And you could say, well, that was him. He was all about preserving his legacy and the theater of it all. But it also, at that center that you've talked about, it's a glimpse where young people get a chance to see and have had to listen to a prime minister talk about those accomplishments and be part of something that you don't get. Like, you really don't get it in many places ever.
There was a great piece of video I saw. There's so much being rehashed today. But there was one I saw, and it was a bit Mulroney had taped for a prime minister's dinner. Paul Martin was prime minister. And Mulroney is sitting at the desk and he opens up, Mesdames et Messieurs, good evening, MPPs and Chief Justice and the fellow Supreme Court members and all this. And he goes through everybody and the members of the media are all there. And then, fuck you, Peter Newman. End of bit.
And Peter probably took that in the spirit it was intended.
Oh, absolutely. But like he was there. He was in on all those jokes. He got it. Yeah. And was able to deliver too.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing we can't leave aside was that while he was genuinely, I would say, magnanimous in his later years, he was fiercely partisan during. When I was at Angus Reid and we were just new, I mean, we had started doing the polling in the public domain with media. We were the first ones to do polling with media starting about 1990. I can't remember whether it was Charlottetown or Meech Lake. I think it was Meech Lake. There was a great photograph on one of the fronts of the newspaper, and it was a Brian Mulroney standing at a podium, and he was tearing up something. I can't remember what it was. It's a famous photograph of him there, and I think he's tearing. I don't know. We did a poll and released it with Southern News, and Angus Reid wrote an op-ed in the Ottawa Citizen. And you have to remember that at that time, polling companies are on a roster, and you have to compete for it. It was the Ontario government, actually under Bob Rae, that put that competition in place for the first time. And we were on a roster, which allowed us to then bid on business. And we had business, and most companies in Ottawa, Goldfarb, and everybody were fairly weighted. And Angus wrote an op-ed that said every time that Brian Mulroney opened his mouth and talked about this accord, he would drop 10 points in the polls. Hugh Segal at that time was Mulroney's chief of staff, and we were using fax machines at that time. And that appeared at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And by 8:30, there was a fax that arrived at Daryl Bricker's office in Ottawa. And it said, it was from Hugh Segal, and it said,
and just to fill in the blank, Daryl Bricker worked with the Angus Reid firm.
He was he had opened the Angus Reid office in Ottawa, and I was in Toronto. And it said on it, "You are no longer welcome to do any business with the government of Canada." Signed, Hugh Segal.
Wow.
And so you couldn't get off the roster. And we continued to bid on business. And so I can't remember. I think it was Senator Lowell Murray was in charge of that process. So we would bid on the business and we would win the business, and then we would never be approved for the business. So, I mean, let's just remember that Brian Mulroney was a strict partisan. He was a bar fight kind of politician. He may have been genteel in some ways afterwards, and he had, he was able to be funny and cordial with people, but he was fiercely partisan. And that was my first kind of introduction in the business world. You were either with him or you were against him, and if you were not with him, you suffered consequences. No question.
Well, Joe Clark, didn't he
Sure.
launch a whisper campaign against Joe Clark and took him out in a pretty vicious manner in party fighting, which is always the most vicious.
Well, it's worth remembering, though, Clark won the first round.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean,
True.
Mulroney stepped in. He wanted to be the leader, and he was the outsider at that point. Yeah. And Clark won it. I forget how many ballots in. Didn't last long, but you know what I find remarkable is, and we've gone through this here in Ontario and certainly federally to some degree, where we've seen changes in leadership at the party level, and you might have one or two, maybe three people who are interested in running. In the case of the NDP here in Ontario, nobody. Merritt Stiles was the slow one to step back, and she looked like she stepped forward, so she got the job. The number of people, if you guys recall, who ran, in that first one, that Joe Clark won, and then the one that Mulroney ultimately won, and then the one that Kim Campbell even won, there had to have been 8, maybe 9 in some cases. It was an extraordinary roster of candidates. So even there, it spoke to a certain quality and character of politics in the House of Commons. No question, John, it was fierce and could be, like a knife fight in a phone booth at times. Mm-hmm. But there was the character and quality of the leadership. It didn't matter what party you were talking about, was something that we have not seen in a while. And the other part of this is, and people will forget it, two majorities by Mulroney meant he had to win, and you will know this better than anybody, he had to win significantly in almost every region of the country. He had to find a way to appeal to Quebec. And remember, in those days, Quebec was ready to walk out the door.
Well, but that's the other, one could call it the brilliance of it all, was he was able to co-opt the separatists. I mean, and you look at the roadmap of Quebec nowadays for Mr. Trudeau or for the Bloc Québécois or even for the NDP at the time. Let's not forget that Lucien Bouchard was in his cabinet, and he was able to co-opt them and bring them on side. It was a remarkable growing of coalitions across the country in different political ranks. And when he left the stage and there were only 2 seats left, it gave birth to the Reform Party. He'd been able to keep that all under one lid during that time frame. And I'd end off by saying, it was also the measure of the times that while people like to have these elections of leaders, kind of in the sanitized version of everybody votes 2 weeks in advance and you kind of get the ranking ballots and here you go at 5 o'clock and here you go at 7 o'clock. And this is and everybody knows that it's been done up well ahead of time. There was something magical about having conventions that were delegated. And this was the drama of not only Brian Mulroney, but was also, every Liberal leader that followed until more recent days. And to be part of that and to be, in that room when that happened was magic. It was incredible to watch, incredible dread. The last one I saw, I remember probably close to that, was Kathleen Wynne, where it was delegated, and there were people who moved across. Charles Sousa moved across the floor. And there's something. Yeah, I know. There was something about it, and there was something about watching Sandra Pupatello on that stage that night that she gave her presentation, and you realized at the end of it she'd lost. You realized it because it was all show and not personalized, whereas Kathleen Wynne came out and was completely different. It was Sandra Pupatello to lose. And she did. So those were days of great theater as well.
Well, Bob Ray lost it the night he forgot to speak French when he was running for the Liberal League. I mean, so there were so many moments in those campaigns for leadership, and the one thing I do remember about the Kim Campbell convention, it was in Ottawa, and they were holding it at the arena in Ottawa. And for those of you who know, it's right next to the football field, which was downtown. And based on the way it's built, the one side of the rink, as I recall, the stands were sort of shortened because they were underneath, literally, the stands from the football field next door. So you had the roof kind of on an angle, and that was those were the seats for the football field. So it was this funny little arena down there, and we were working. I was at 640 at the time, and it's the first time that I can recall we sent several radio stations to represent a national story. So there was me from Toronto. We had a team from Hamilton there, and John Ashworth. What was the guy's name from CN?
Ashworth.
Ashworth. And, talk about having a voice. John had the big voice, too. And he came from Vancouver, CKNW, and they had a team there. So we were set up with our backs to the front door of the arena, and we could look down into the bowl, and you could see everybody and so on. So after the first day, remember the days when they had the rush for seats, right? Remember you had all the delegates, and they'd have all the kids, the volunteers, all lined up, and they'd ring the bell, and everybody'd run and try and get as many seats as they could for the various candidates. And so that was the fun of the day, that first day, and there was a little bit of activity. And so we're getting ready, and we're getting close to the deadline. And everybody's busy, head down. Everybody's writing their stories, and they're cutting their tape, and we can hear. And everybody ignores it, and we're hard at work, and we can hear behind us, and like turn around, like, what the fuck? What's wrong with you people? And I turn around, it's Mila Mulroney knocking on the door.
Ooh.
So I opened the door, and she said, "I'm sorry, I have to use the bathroom."
Ah.
So we let her in. But the Mounties followed it in. But anyway, it's just one of those out of the blue things that happen. And the only other, there's lots of stories we can tell, and how Mulroney loved to go to CFRB. Mm-hmm. He loved to sit in the studio there and hold court from the days of Wally Crowder right through until the early 2000s. And he'd come through the back door there off of the building at Yonge and St. Clair, up through those stairs and so on. It was to your point, John, it was a very slow walk up the stairs usually. It doesn't matter how many people were in the stairwell. But the thing that I will always remember, in our family yesterday when there was news broke that Brian Mulroney had passed away, we have a text message that everybody's on it in the family. And they were expressing condolences for my sister-in-law. And everyone's going, well, why would you do that? Well, when she was a teenager in high school, Brian Mulroney was the new leader of the Conservative Party, and he might have just been the prime minister. She invited him to her graduation. She sent him a letter inviting the prime minister to attend her graduation at Loretto Abbey in Toronto, and he answered her. He answered her in a personal letter.
Nice.
That said, "Listen, wow, I'm honored and privileged to have been invited, and I'm such a great event for you, and blah 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 blah. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, my schedule's very busy, so I'm not sure that I'd be able to make it." But he went on, and nice sign off, and she's got this letter now, all these years later, framed and on hanging on the wall. So to your point, John, it wasn't just even about those calls and connections with people who, cross paths or swords with him politically. It seems as though he had that wherewithal. And even in the voice, I'm pretty sure the voice of the letter wasn't staff.
No,
the other thing too,
letter.
and again, I'm interested in your both of your reflections on this, because I wasn't anywhere close to being in the room, nor back rooms or policy stuff. But we remember, people nowadays will not, unless they are of our vintage, remember the premier's conferences that took place in Ottawa. They were stunning. To think that you would gather around first Pierre Trudeau and the Constitution, with Senator Michael, or later Michael Kirby, and René Lévesque sitting across the table. These were televised nationally. You could watch everything that took place. And then Mulroney went through the same thing, where you would have had him together, and there would have been the tie into Ontario would have been David Peterson. He was there between 85 and 90, and he's 80 years old now. Just having had his birthday about a month ago. They were spectacles, but they were also transparent. You were watching what was going on. And yes, the Constitution was actually crafted by Jean Chrétien, Roy Romano, and Roy McMurtry in a kitchen behind, but it spoke to it spoke to an openness where there was public pressure through watching what was going on to come up with some kind of a deal. It was a different kind of thing, as opposed to, the declaration, I'm not going to meet with the provinces because it's all show. I'm not going to have a premier's meeting, and we're not going to do this. They were televised spectacles, which yes, in some ways, to some people would have been like watching drying paint on the wall. But I challenge anybody nowadays who wants to look at a piece of history, how you can grab onto something that was so open. Like, you can go back and watch that. You can read the transcripts. You can read the anecdotes around it. You can read the interviews, and to see the ones that you guys gave at the time. And you can pull it all together with a really good impression of the time. We don't have that nowadays. It's a very cynical time now, as opposed to a time when those sort of things were necessary to take place.
Well, and it kind of gets us into the conversation around provincial politics. I mean, the underlying tone of that wasn't necessarily that they agreed on things politically, but Keith, there was an understanding that each one had a lane and a responsibility, and you had to at least respect that.
Absolutely. And that's the way it was always done. And quite frankly, it still is even today at Queen's Park. It's lost completely on Parliament Hill, but at the Ontario Legislature, there's still some of that inter-party collegiality. I mean, where I've seen a couple of guys go at it, Dwight Duncan, and I'm trying to think of the Conservative. He's no longer an MPP, but they went at it at a committee one day, and it was pretty vicious. And afterwards, in the hallway, they just walked up and said, "Leave it on the ice," shook hands, and that was it. And we scrummed them both because we thought, there was some harsh ass comments there. Yeah, well, he's completely wrong, but he's not a bad person, And that's, if we could just get back to that, if we could just get back to, and a lot of it used to be when because they would have they'd be on these committees, and these committees would meet in the evening, and they would have to get together, maybe have a little bit of supper. Mm-hmm. And speakers used to do this, used to bring people in from each party and have dinner with them, just to have people talking and getting to know each other outside of these harsh caucus party affiliation, where you just get rabid and into your entrenched positions. No. There's a lot of respect for people, and you would see it. Funnily enough, I saw it at my own and at other retirements from the Queen's Park Press Gallery. You'd see 3 or 4 premiers come in, and of different stripes, because they'd all change up. And Bob Ray would come in, and Kathleen Wynne, and Peterson, and Mike Harris, and they'd be funny and engage with each other. And then as soon as the speeches were over, they would all leave as a group.
Right.
They were all because they had common roots, and of course they were there. They made their appearance, but it was done with, and the humor and the shots at each other, and it was all done. Yes, technically off the record, but it was just, you could see these people had genuine respect and like for each other. Even Mike Harris, they liked Mike Harris. Yes, they disagreed with him vehemently, but they could talk to the guy, and he could talk to them. And Harris would come in. I remember him even, at mine, he says, "What am I being blamed for today?" Because it never stopped. And yet he knew as well, that's his role. That's his lane. I'm the tough guy. I'm the common sense guy. But yeah, I'm going to take it on the chin. I'm going to be the guy that takes the blame for a lot of stuff. And he's still taking the blame for a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, though, that even federally, in terms of how, John, you talk about the idea of the First Minister's meeting, the tone and quality of it. When was the last time we had one?
Well, but that's the point.
Right.
I think,
as if there isn't something important enough for all 12, of the territorial and provincial leaders to get together around the table with the Prime Minister. There's got to be something worth talking about. I mean, clearly, all the problems aren't solved in this country.
Well, yeah, but there is. But I think it's all a matter of the willingness by the Prime Minister to take the risk. Mulroney was up to that. Mulroney was, you can say he had a huge ego, but he had a sense that there was more to be won in the room than there was out of it. And I think he played the angles. It's like a smart pool player. You never hit the ball smack on. You're playing it off the bank shots. You're calculating how it's going to be. I guess it began pretty much with Stephen Harper, where it was, and Jim Flaherty, where it's kind of like, no, we're not going to meet with you because it's nothing but a bunch of rhetoric, and we're all going to get yelled at. See you later, and here you go. But there oftentimes is much more to be made of it when you are able to manipulate the room politically, when you're able to, at the end of the day, remember, you've got like 10 premiers sitting around the table and one prime minister. And to walk out of that room and have people say, he won the day, compared to he got the crap beat out of him. Brian Mulroney went into those rooms and was able to calculate politically how it should be played. And he had very smart people around him. So, I mean, there's a lot of credit that has to be done there for him and the team of the Times. But you also look to today, and there's a lot of timidity. There is a sense that if you walk into that room, you're going to get slaughtered, and why
So
take
what?
the risk?
Fight back. Your position should be strong enough to fight
Of
back.
course.
I remember I covered one of the first ministers' meetings in Ottawa on Aboriginal rights, trying to get Aboriginal rights enshrined in the Constitution. And yeah, there's something to seeing this sometimes as dry as paint or watching paint dry, but other times you watch the dynamic in the room. You see the premiers with their staff behind them. All of a sudden, the staff's leaning in. Why is the Ontario premier staff leaning in on this particular point that the prime minister is making? Why is Saskatchewan doing this? Why is Manitoba? And you start to see the dynamics. You start to see, and then the smart federal politicians start to see, those 13 premiers are not united. I can help this person. I'm going to have to upset this person. You work the room. But that one was all of Canada trying to figure out how to deal with Aboriginal issues and the Constitution. They didn't settle it, but they dealt with it as a country in public, on TV, and there were disagreements. But at least we could see what the debates were. We could see what the positions were and understand why people felt the way they did. Now what do we see? We don't know what they feel other than their positions are this, and they don't want to have to defend them in public because they're going to get beat up in TV cameras. So
it also takes us to where we are in Ontario, because I mean we're doing the Ontario podcast here. And again, I'll repeat what I've said, and it's been echoed. I mean, the legacy of Doug Ford after 2 terms is kind of a buck of beer, retail, liquor in the corner stores, Staples, talking about, long-term beds as if they were homes in themselves. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here which tends to be very retail politics as opposed to big picture legacy stuff. And it just seems to me, again, I'm not casting aspersions on this government, but when you are in that position, you have the moment. You have the power. You have, especially with back-to-back majority governments, you can do what you wish. And it's kind of like that's the time to take on the tough issues. That's the time to make these decisions where you're not constantly backpedaling and redoing and trying to just save your political skin. This is the time. So we have a growing and aging population. We have healthcare issues. We have long-term care issues. We have the boomers who are going to be on the doorstep by 2036, exhausting the healthcare system. And yet there's no kind of bringing together into this national kind of view of how do we make this happen? It's all of the retail stuff instead, and that's
we're going to get highways though. We're going to get some new highways.
Yeah, and
infrastructure. Like it's all about the same old stuff. I mean, as you say, these are easy, low-hanging fruit type ideas, but they're massively expensive as well. Pushing through with these, that's what they want their legacy to be. That they've tackled these transit lines, that they've tackled the Highway 413, as opposed to putting trucks onto 407 or something else. These are where they want to go. This is what they feel is their legacy. They don't care about the environment. They will move to more privatization of care, of public health care, but only because they believe they're getting better results. That's their firm belief. They're paying more, but they're getting better results in their opinion. I think in the long term, that's going to be a fallacy. But for now, this is where they're going. They know what they want to do here. But why? Why are they always putting seemingly the big guy over the little guy? And we saw it again when they overruled the Ontario Energy Board, which is supposed to look out for consumers, and said, no, Enbridge will not have to absorb the cost of its new infrastructure. They can pass that along to their existing customers. And this gets very interesting because part of the problem is, in theory, that infrastructure is not going to be needed in 20 years. We're going to have phased people off gas lines for new homes. So who's to pay for that infrastructure? Well, the government says, no. Developers shouldn't pay. Enbridge shouldn't pay. Customers, the Ontario ratepayers, should pay. Why? This is the first time the government has ever overruled the Ontario Energy Board, which is supposed to look out for consumer interests. I've never seen them do this before. The Energy Board is not exactly known as a radical organization. In fact, I used to criticize them very heavily when I was a reporter. But here they are actually acting on behalf of ratepayers, of gas ratepayers. And the government's literally overruling them. I don't understand why, but it just adds into this thing of, again, looking out for the big guy instead of the little guy.
Well, and we can get into it. We probably should dive more deeply into some of the nuance of that, because it's really, you talk about the future in terms of, what are we going to do with gas and so on, and the question around environment and the carbon emissions and all of those sorts of things. I'll just say district heating is the answer. And there are ways of doing that, and maybe even using that infrastructure. And, there's a project underway right now up at Downsview Park here in Toronto that is going to engage with the experiment of district heating in, the largest urban center in Canada. Will it work? And essentially that's, rather than delivering gas to your house, it's delivering hot water. And it heats everything with hot water. And so you don't need your hot water heater. And in fact, you probably don't even need your furnace, right? You might need a heat pump, but the point is that everything is heated with this water, and the water is heated by the energy that's created through the heat of other buildings and exhaust. And, anyway, it's a fascinating idea. But this is where the province is nibbling around the fucking edges all the time and getting into it short-term sight with, the Ontario Energy Board, rather than saying, this is where we want to be in 20 years. We're looking right now at where we are now. And to your point, John, yes, it's retail view of things. The irony in all of this is that we've spent 35 of the last 40 minutes talking about Brian Mulroney, who is the poster boy for retail politics, right? So let's leave it there, guys. Let's have a good weekend. I know we didn't get into as much on the Ontario politics, but we would have been remiss if we hadn't spent time talking about, clearly a significant political character in this country's history. And the three of us probably in a pretty good seat. We enjoyed watching it develop and had fun doing so over the course of his career. And we've all crossed paths with to some degree, with the Mulroney family and the kids. And so our condolences certainly to the Mulroneys. And we know that there'll be funeral arrangements will be announced in the coming days. So it'll be interesting to see how the country responds to that. One of the things I'll just leave with is that I was watching the tributes come in. There was very little politics in the conversation. Way to go. And social media was not full of the bullshit that you would otherwise expect. And I thought, wow, Mulroney not only tamed the country and brought together a conservative coalition, he actually managed to tame Twitter when he passed away yesterday at the age of 84. That'll do it. It's the On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford, Keith Leslie, and John Wright for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.